Welcome, everybody. It's the 4 o'clock hour on Business Monday. It is a busy, busy business day in the state of Rhode Island. New flights, direct flights out of TF Green announced this morning, alive on GoLocal. They are flying via Sun Country out to Las Vegas and New Orleans, I think two fan favorites. There was a ribbon cutting. We'll talk about it in a minute over at the new hotel down at the base of College Hill. That was about a couple hours ago. And then tonight there's a hearing on Fane Tower, a critical in the possibility of that 46-story, $300 million edifice being built. Gary Sass is with us, the money man. Cha-ching. This weekend, was it a busy weekend out in the sun, raking leaves, or was it just sitting in counting your money?
Neither. It was Final Four week.
Final Four?
Final Four.
What was your team in the Final Four?
Oh, I got teams all over the place.
You've got teams all over the place. And what is your relationship to them? Any actual connection?
Probably because my kids go to some of them. Grandkids.
My dear friend, long-standing friend since the age of 13, is a Duke grad. He's down at the Final Four. He's near suicide yet again, that Duke is not. And I just remind him that that's the problem when you rent players for 1 year. They're not real college students. They probably go to school for 3 months, then the basketball season. They've dropped out of classes by the end of the basketball season, and they are on to the NBA.
Well, I'm not a Duke fan, but I would say this. Going to Duke for 3 months is probably more valuable than going to a lot of other schools for 4 years.
Especially if you're going in the first round of the NBA draft, and you're going to make a couple $100 million over the rest of your career. Let's start up at the State House. Mike DeBiase was on with Kate Nagel last week, ringing, I think, a little bit of a warning bell on the state budget numbers. We'll have a piece tomorrow on the some interesting insights into the lack of revenue on the sports betting side. It was supposed to bring in $23.5 million. What's your take on the situation? Here we are, almost no unemployment, a great stock market, cranes everywhere, and we've got not enough revenue.
Well, and that's the great surprise. We spend too much money. It's not very complicated. There are only two sides to the equation, spending and revenue. And because we spend so much revenue and we're not generating enough growth in the economy, there's a gap, and that's what's happened. And there are also extenuating, factors. There always are. Through February, state revenues are running behind. They're running behind about 1.5%, about $33 million. Tax revenues running behind over 2%, about $46 million. And I would urge caution because the key month is April. If April comes in very strong, some of those numbers could be mitigated. The gap could be closed. So we just have to wait and see. That's always the case. March and April are big revenue months. But the point being that the estimates really didn't take into consideration some things that are pretty important. I'll give you one example. About 2/3 of the revenue shortfall is attributed to one factor. And that factor is the personal income tax. And people that know a lot about this say the estimate was shaky because we didn't get a good handle on how the change in federal tax law, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, would affect states, particularly as it relates to deductibility. And so that we'll have to wait and see how income tax collections come in April. That gap could be closed. I don't know if it will be closed, but I think when you look at the employment numbers, when you look at projected growth in the economy, you have to be concerned. I am hopeful that the gap can be closed, but no one knows, and it'd be foolish to try to project. It could get worse, but we'll see. But this is not the first year that we left with a big gap and waiting for see what happens with April collections.
So one of the additional challenges, maybe, we had one of the leading representatives, partners from one of the leading CPA firms in the state of Rhode Island, where they're giving guidance to all their corporate clients to take the extension off till the later part of the year. That's further going to create some complications. People aren't going to make payments till late into next
Well, yeah,
de facto.
that's a cash problem. It's a cash flow problem, right?
And but it's also going to further delay an understanding of exactly where everybody is. And I think that's really the biggest question.
Well, there's a much bigger question. That's part of the question, but there's a much bigger issue. This budget is one of the weakest budgets I've seen in 40 years of watching budgeting put together. So we know a couple of things about this budget. We know three things about the budget. We know there was proposed to be a significant number of revenue and fee increases. We know that significant out-year budget deficits were projected. And we know that the governor kind of ignored it and recommended, at least in the general fund, spending grow by twice the rate of inflation. We had 200 new jobs. So there was a disconnect. And when you do that kind of budgeting, any factor, it could throw you off, even if it's small. And so I think it needs to be put in perspective. Assuming that tax revenue stays below estimate, it was 2% below estimate. It wasn't 5 or 10% below estimate. It's not good, it's tough, but we've created an but a fiscal environment where we cut things so close to the bone, where we're not cognizant of what our ability and capacity is to support programs, and yet we recommend more spending and more spending and more spending. And I think there's a lack of seriousness about how to address the state's fiscal problems.
Let me ask you a question. Could this spiral wear off and we don't know anything, where there's so many questions? Could this be could we not be off 2% or 3% or 4%, but could we be off 7% or 8%, where we're talking real money, hard to correct? The only way to deal with it is to make real cuts into very significant programs. Forget Rhode Island Promise being extended to RIC. We're talking about some real slashing into some fundamental programs.
Well, a couple of things. I don't know the answer to that question, but I'll kind of speculate, just scenarios. Keep in mind, we're pretty far through the fiscal year. We've collected about 65% of revenue on most of the major revenue sources. After April, we'll have a better answer to your question because most of the income tax money will come in. I have a tremendous amount of confidence in the people in the Department of Revenue that do this. And obviously,
the Paul Dion's, the long-standing pros who've been doing this.
Budget people, people in the Office of Revenue Analysis, the people who affect the taxes in the Division of Taxation. We have a good, strong group there. And I have confidence, in their, forecasting and their ability to manage, revenue. So I'm hopeful, that we know what the problem is in withholding, not coming in. We know what the problem is because of the federal change. So I think they're probably in the realm of, reasonableness, though that doesn't make the problem any less significant, and certainly it can get larger, but you have to wait till you see the numbers.
Sure.
I think we have good people, good professional people, managing, this. And the same is true of the legislative staff. The fiscal advisors to the House and Senate are professional, as well. So that's one factor. But the bigger factor is the lack of a financial plan.
Mm-hmm.
We've put the budget together, as I mentioned before. The budget grows by 4%. Inflation's running about 2%. Head count's up by 200 people. And you'd say, well, if things get bad, let's cut. Let's talk about what we can cut and what the ideology and the politics of this administration, this legislature are about. No one wants to cut education.
Mm-hmm.
And education, amounts to about 27% of the budget. So you can cut new programs. You can cut the pre-K program. You can cut expansion of the Promise program. I think you ought to cut the entire Promise program out altogether, but that's not politically realistic. But you can't cut out your investment in local schools. You can't cut out consideration of additional investment for kids that are English language learners so they can get ahead. If you look at their test scores and their performance with kids that are more proficient in English, the gap is really a savage inequality of two states. So you have trouble cutting education. No one's going to recommend you cut education. After the RICAS test scores came in, education was crisis number one. And I get a kick out of these people who run around as education crusaders and really don't want to sit down and have a serious conversation about how lousy our ed funding formula is and how we are funding education. Second issue, of the almost $10 billion budget, about 2.5 to 3 billion are medical assistance programs.
Right.
The state shares about 40%. Federal shares about 60% of those medical assistance programs. We have contracts. We can't cut those medical assistance programs. A lot of those people receive, managed care, through these programs.
So what do we do? Let's just say this thing balloons up for this fiscal year to $100 million. Not out of the realm of possibility.
Well, if it balloons up, I don't want to speculate about $100 million.
Let's speculate about $100 million.
Well,
a guy whose nickname is the Money Man. If the Money Man won't speculate about $100 million, who the heck will?
The reason the Money Man is called the Money Man is he only speculates about sure things, and there's nothing sure about that. But to answer your question, even if it doesn't bloom, let's say it stays, where it is. Let's say revenues are behind 70 million over the 2 fiscal year period, which I don't know if that's going to be the case. And let's say that we know that 85% of the budget is spent on 3 things: spent on human services. No one's going to cut human services.
Right.
Spent on education, except for new programs. No one's going to go deep in education. And the other 15% are salaries and people covered by union contracts and the cost of general government. And so then you have to begin to make some policy choices. And one of the issues that I would suppose would have to be put back on the table is what are you going to do on the revenue side? And that's where the dog begins to chase his tail, because if you want to create a more competitive economic climate and you begin to talk about broad-based revenue increases, which no one wants, you're robbing from Peter to pay Paul.
Wallet Hub has a study. We published it today in the cheat sheet. Rhode Island has the 6th highest tax burden, another way to look at what the responsibility of taxpayers are rather than to just look at rates, what the cumulative impact of the different tax rates versus the population is, the tax burden. 6th highest, New York being number 1. Alaska may be the target for people to start flying direct out of green, ranks 50th in tax burden. Probably not a big appetite by Rhode Islanders to assume any new increases in any of the major taxes.
Well, you have to break that down. The generalization, really doesn't help you that much in making policy decisions. A couple of things about the Wallet Hub study. 4 of the 10 worst tax states were New England.
Absolutely.
Well, and then if 4 of the 10 worst tax states in New England are in one region of the country, in one 6-state area, if 40% of the worst.
Well, in part because the federal tax reform changes that the deductibility of mortgages was a big factor.
It was a factor, but the bigger factor, which no one wants to talk about, is the reason that our tax burden is relatively high compared to other people is not the sales tax we pay on a per capita basis or on a basis of taxes related to the economy, not the income tax. But keep in mind, we've reduced the marginal rate from almost 11% to 6%, broadened the base in doing that. It is the property tax.
Right.
And the property tax gets back to the question of how do you fund your education system. And so it's a lot of BS to say, well, we have a high tax state. We're a high property tax state. We're a high property tax state because we've got a lousy school aid formula, and the state contributes a relatively smaller portion of the cost of operating schools than compared to most states. And that's what people don't want to discuss, and that's what they need to discuss. There needs to be, the governor spoke about truth in numbers when she did her pension reform, when she was general treasurer. Well, we need a little bit of truth in numbers of why we're here and what the options are, and so I don't buy. We're a high property tax state, not a high sales tax state. Now we're a high sales tax state in terms of the 7% rate, but in terms of collection per $1,000 of income, we're probably well below the national average. So it's complicated, and we have people who jump to these simplistic conclusions.
Well, speaking of simplistic conclusions, let's go to simplistic failure. You talk about high property tax rates. High property tax rates, in the case of Providence, are not being used to pay for pension obligations. Providence's pension obligation is about $1 billion. It's OPEB, health care, et cetera. Other retirement obligations are about another $1 billion. To fix up the schools is another $600 or $700 million. Mayor Alorza had a proposal I think he was the last one to find out that it was dead, but last week he pulled it off the resuscitator.
He must have gone swimming in the Situate Reservoir. It must have been cold. He's out there by himself.
He realized that that proposal was dead. That the proposal was to monetize the Situate Reservoir, which provides about 60-something% of Rhode Islanders with their drinking water. No one wanted to hear it from him. He wanted to use the money to address the massive unfunded liability that faces the city of Providence. You're the grand guru on these things. What in God's name does Providence do to deal with its long-term financial obligations locked in on OPEB and on pensions?
Well, there are three things you can do. You can't sell an asset. You can't monetize an asset. That's never a good idea to meet operating costs by selling your assets. Okay, so you have to look at the outflow, and there are two things about the outflow. One, we have contractual obligations to pensioners. The second is we got to begin to negotiate, with the unions and get givebacks as far as pension benefits are concerned.
Okay, but he didn't just get elected to his first term. He's now in year 5.
Yeah, but I'm not.
These obligations aren't a surprise.
But I go back.
Somebody didn't just pop into his office. Mayor, I've got some bad news. I just learned we owe $1 billion in unfunded pension obligations.
I think he fits the long tradition of mayors of Providence. I'm going to get through this the best I can, and I can't afford to increase.
That is also why there's a rich history of Providence. Mayors, other than David Cicilline, almost bankrupt the city, having not long after political careers.
Well, we had one mayor that made a comeback, our friend.
Yeah.
But so that's the issue is you have to get some of the money from the payout. You have to get givebacks from the unions. You have to see if you can negotiate some givebacks that are contractually provided for. You have to determine how much management authority you have to reduce pension benefits going forward, which won't solve the problem today, but that's the first point.
Yeah.
The second point, and I think the city may have done this, you can't get out of this mess in 1 year or 2 years. Most people put together, a 20-year or 25-year get well plan. And that get well plan includes reduced benefits and includes increased revenue. And the third part, and I feel like a one-horse song pony on this thing. When I look at the amount of money the city of Providence gets from the state, and I am not one to say we should just dump more state money into Providence, because I had to walk 2 or 3 blocks to get here, and I'm not sure how wise that investment always would be, but it gets back to the share of education, being funded by the state. And so if you could get the state to adopt a more aggressive role, which would be very hard based on our previous conversation, to fund schools, you could then begin to use some of that property tax dollars. And then the other option, which I don't believe in, but you will hear this floated now, is when do you get to a point of some kind of extraordinary financial plan, like having a master come into the city, or a receiver, declare bankruptcy, which you can't declare without the state's permission, and the state's not about to give their permission. And I'm not sure it's a good idea, because there are reputational risks when you do that. But at a certain point, as pension spending to support pension obligations, it takes an increasing portion of the budget, and it takes money, it freezes money out of schools and public safety. Then you have to look at the Grim Reaper.
But let's talk about, let's revert back to the beginning of this entire conversation about the state budget. We're in pretty good times. I mean, this is growth. What is it, 3% GDP growth in the fourth quarter in the United States? We're talking about a period of time of increased wages, low unemployment. People have some money, they pay their property taxes, they're able to do some things.
We should legalize marijuana soon so people will feel better. But now look at the real numbers of Rhode Island. Now, it's easy to get caught up in the national numbers. It's easy to get caught up in the regional numbers. It is true.
Record number of Rhode Islanders are working.
And it's true that our unemployment rate is at the national average right now.
4%, 3.9%.
Yeah, so we're basically at full employment. But it is also true that in the last quarter of 18, our state product grew by 0.2%. Nationally, it grew by 2%.
Well, but that's exactly my point. My point is we've just gone through a 9-year recovery from the bleakest period of time since the 1930s. We've been in a growth period. This isn't going to last forever.
No, but
We're going to have a real recession.
No, there are fundamentals that are hard to address. They're easy to point out, hard to address. And so we have an economic development theory, strategy. Well, I don't think it's a strategy, but an economic development program that's very transactional. And so we're using what other states use as tax incentives and incentives to get people to do real estate, to build things. At the same time, and this is why you get into the problem, we're one of the lowest states in terms of population growth. The old theory is if you don't have people, you don't have economic growth. We don't have people. We haven't got any new people. That's a reality. It's a reality that the number of Rhode Islanders working hasn't come up to the level it was in 2006, though we have made progress. It's reality that the number of payroll jobs in Rhode Island has been flat for the last year, probably down a little bit. Those are the realities that we're dealing with, and for some reason, when you go
So what's the reality going to be, though, when we go into a recession, a real live recession?
Well, the reality is going to be...
Is it catastrophic?
I don't know, because you might argue that, yes, some people argue, first in, last out. Maybe we never got out as far as other people, so we won't fall back as far. That happened back in the 90s when there was the technology recession.
Right.
And since we had no technology,
Right.
we skated. We were fine. You ask me...
We had the same number of Burger King jobs as everybody else.
Yeah, I could just... I don't know. I haven't got a crystal ball. And if I did, it wouldn't be better than anybody else's. But I do know this, that we talk about ribbon cuttings at hotels. We talk about all kind of real estate developments. And yet, population growth, there's no growth in labor force, there's no growth in the labor participation rate. Those are the real problems, and we need to have we need to elect political leaders that'll sit down and say, shoot, it's not about giving my friend or XY's General Electric tax incentives to create 64 jobs here. It's really about what do we do to build clusters. There was work that was done years ago by Michael Porter at Harvard, and he which I think is classic. He's my guru, so I have prejudice. And he basically said, if you wanted to do economic development, invest like hell in good schools, keep things competitive, and make sure you grow clusters, because there has to be a multiplier dynamic in job development. It doesn't do you a whole lot of good to create 64 jobs here and 100 jobs there and 50 jobs there. It's a good thing to do, but it doesn't...
It doesn't hurt, but it's not going to build any longer-term momentum.
It helps. Your nose is in the door, but you have to have a strategy. Everything, there has to be transactions, there have to be negotiations. That's part of economic development. Real estate's part of economic development. But there also is a part that deals with strategy and tactics and dealing with the fundamentals. And, if you put a few $1 million into a good program like the Wavemaker program, and 100 kids or 1,000 kids or 5,000 kids can stay here because they get some forgiveness on their college loans, that is a good program.
Right.
That's not a game-changing program. You still haven't dealt with the fundamentals, and that is what I think is politically lacking in this state. Is that ability to confront the reality and talk about the reality, and not think that the people in Rhode Island are just rocks in the mud that won't understand it.
So let me raise two issues. Is the Wavemaker, Rebuild Rhode Island, are those the things you have to do, though, to change the perception of Rhode Island of being de facto, I think what many thought be an anti-business state, to be more of a pro-business state?
Well, those are things, there's two answers to that question. First answer is...
just give me the good answer, the best answer.
Well, no, because they're both related. But the answer is yes, that you have to do those kinds of things to compete because other people do them as well. So you have to have tax incentives. You have to have programs that incentivize college graduates to stay here. Absolutely. But the second part of that question is you have to do it strategically, and you have to do it well. And you have to do it with an eye towards how do I build a cluster. And the third part of the answer to that question is even if you do those things and you have a lousy tax climate, and our tax climate's gotten better, I can talk about that. That's one of the things we've made improvement. but you have a lousy education system. You have a perception of a government that doesn't really care about the quality of public services, and population's not growing, because if I come to work for Hasbro, it's just as easy for me to live in Rehoboth and send my kids to school in Massachusetts. That's the dynamic you have to change, and that's not the dynamic we speak about. We speak about, and just think about this for a second. We have known for a long time that we have failing schools, particularly in the inner cities.
Absolutely.
And we've known for a long time
40 years.
There are too many kids that get out of third grade can't read, which kind of dooms them to a challenge for the rest of their lives. And what do? Oh, we do promise program that gives tuition without dealing about quality. We talk about, which is a good program. My kids benefited from it. A universal pre-K. That would help. But you have to think about these things strategically. The biggest strategic issue we have in the state right now is we have a lot of English learning kids, and we're not investing enough to make sure they're very proficient in English. And until we do that, you can have all these other boutique programs you want, and it can make much of a difference.
Let's say we dip into a recession. Is that the time for Providence to really go after a fundamental financial overhaul to try and shed some of these long-term obligations on pensions and on OPEB?
Well, the time to have come up with more realistic pension programs, wasn't next year or in the future when we go into recession. It was 20 years ago. And because of the politics and because of the way we negotiate contracts.
Well, one huge problem is we've now had pretty much every mayor in the last 30 years has run for governor. Cianci ran against Garrihy. Paolino ran for governor. Cicilline ran for Congress, not governor. Tavares ran for governor.
He bankrupt the city, couldn't run for governor. But there's a question.
So they didn't want to go to war with public unions.
You have to, and Mayor Tavares made some progress. He got some reform on the pension. It was just a start. It wasn't the end by a long shot. Question is if you want to be a successful politician, you have to be a successful governor, and get elected, you have to be a successful mayor. You can have all the friends and all the interest groups in the world, and it hasn't worked.
Right.
The last person I remember being elected governor of Rhode Island from Providence was one of the guys that hired me was Denny Roberts.
That was around the Magna Carta? Right around the Magna Carta.
Some people probably don't associate that, but it was he was mayor in the 50s, I think, in the 1950s.
The last governor that was a mayor was Ed Dupree back in 1984.
That helped us out. So the point being, the game that they're playing, political game, that they're playing to be elected mayor has not been successful. And you know the definition of insanity, don't you?
Keep doing the same thing and have an expectation of a different result.
And so if there was a mayor who was viewed as being tough, taking some chances, solving the problem, restructuring, I think there's a hell of a lot of votes out there.
Yeah.
The other issue too, and you can't separate the state from the city of Providence. And I've spoken before about the inadequacies in the way we fund education, particularly in some of the urban communities. There are also other issues of governmental efficiency and effectiveness that the city can't be a self-starter because it has to work with other cities. And I'll give Congressman Cicilline his due on this one. When he was mayor, he spoke about a metropolitan public safety district, which is you're not talking about consolidating in metropolitan governments. It's very different. But if you had a metropolitan public safety district, and I don't know what the boundaries would be, but North Providence and maybe part of Johnson, part of Cranston, and Providence, just think of how more efficiently you could use resources, how you could negotiate contracts. So, but that city can't do that unilaterally, and no city is going to do that unilaterally. You need state leadership saying, no, we have to look closely at a metropolitan fire district because the target is to improve coverage and to reduce costs by X%. No one's having that conversation. No one's setting the target. It's always a problem where the mayor can't deal with one union. Well, the fact of the matter is, if you study labor management negotiations, if you have two unions negotiating with 38 management entities, the two unions always win.
Last question, maybe the most important question of the day. Who wins tonight, Virginia or Texas Tech in the NCAA College Basketball Championship?
Well, whatever I say is going to be wrong. I have grandkids that go to UVA, but I think Texas. I think this is Texas Tech's year.
You're going Texas Tech?
I do.
Grandchildren, beware.
Well, I'll be in trouble.
Thanks everybody for tuning in. Gary Sass, as always, the money man, a wealth. Got that? A wealth of knowledge, both on the state and Providence budgetary issues. Tomorrow we'll be back. Actually, stay tuned. I think Kate Nagel will be live in the next couple minutes up at the public hearing on Fain, probably in the next 5 to 10 minutes as the design review in the city of Providence begins that process. We're in year 3 of the proposal to build a $300 million 46-story luxury apartment complex. Be back tomorrow. Kate Nagel's got the 4 o'clock hour. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Stay tuned 24/7. Stuff is breaking all the time. Thanks.